Autistic girl sent to detention, then teacher discovers her true identity. The sharp clang of the school bell echoed through the hallways of Briarwood Elementary, signaling the end of recess. Children hurried back to their classrooms, their laughter and chatter fading as they disappeared behind brightly decorated doors. All except one. Emma, a quiet girl of 10, stood at the edge of the playground, staring at the ground. Her fingers twisted the edge of her brightly patterned shirt as she rocked slightly on her feet. The world around her felt overwhelming. The noise, the motion, the bright sunlight reflecting off the swings. She needed a moment to collect herself before stepping back into the chaos of her classroom. "Emma," a stern voice called from behind her. It was Mrs. Duncan, her teacher, standing with her hands on her hips. "Recess is over. You're late." Again. Emma flinched at the sharpness of the tone but didn't say a word. She looked up briefly, her wide blue eyes meeting Mrs. Duncan's glare, before lowering her gaze again. She wanted to explain why she couldn't move, why the transition from recess to class was so hard for her. But the words stuck in her throat, jumbled and tangled, refusing to come out. "Detention," Mrs. Duncan snapped, her voice carrying finality. "You can explain yourself there." Emma's heart sank, but she didn't argue. She never argued. Instead, she followed Mrs. Duncan back into the school, her footsteps slow and heavy. The other students whispered as she passed, their eyes filled with curiosity and judgment. Emma ignored them. She was used to being different, to standing out in ways she didn't want to. Inside the classroom, Emma took her seat in the back corner, away from the other children. She preferred it that way. The noise and movement were easier to manage from a distance. She pulled out her notebook and began to doodle, her pencil moving in intricate patterns that formed complex shapes and symbols. It was her way of calming down, of finding order in the chaos around her. Mrs. Duncan glanced at Emma, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't understand the girl. Emma was smart, brilliant even, but she never participated in class. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words came out in fragments, as though she was piecing them together in real time. Mrs. Duncan had tried to be patient, but her patience was wearing thin. "Emma," she said, walking over to her desk. "What's this?" She gestured to the notebook. Emma hesitated, her hands hovering protectively over her drawings. "It's just patterns," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Duncan frowned. "You should be working on the math problems I assigned, not doodling." Emma nodded quickly, tucking the notebook away and pulling out her math worksheet. But as she stared at the page, the numbers and symbols blurred together. Her mind couldn't focus. She felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the creeping sensation of being trapped. The rest of the class carried on, the chatter and laughter of her peers blending into a cacophony that made Emma's head throb. She pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. Crying only made things worse. By the time lunch rolled around, Emma was emotionally exhausted. She sat alone at the end of a long table, picking at the sandwich her mother had packed for her. The other kids avoided her, as they always did. She didn't mind. She preferred being alone. But today, her solitude was interrupted. A boy named Tyler, the class troublemaker, sauntered over and plopped down across from her. He smirked, leaning forward on his elbows. "Hey, Emma," he said, his tone mocking. "Why are you so weird?" Emma didn't respond. She kept her eyes on her sandwich, hoping he would get bored and leave her alone. "Are you even listening?" Tyler continued, his voice louder now. "Or are you too busy drawing your stupid little pictures?" Emma's hands clenched into fists under the table, her body tense. She wanted to tell him to stop, to leave her alone, but the words wouldn't come. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Tyler reached out and snatched the notebook from her backpack, flipping through the pages. "What is this junk?" Emma's breathing quickened as she reached for the notebook, panic flooding her system. "Give it back," she said, her voice trembling. Tyler held it out of reach, laughing. "What are these? Alien codes? Are you a secret alien or something?" The laughter drew the attention of other kids, who gathered around the table to watch. Emma's face burned with humiliation as she tried again to grab the notebook, but Tyler held it higher, waving it around like a trophy. "Enough," a deep voice boomed, silencing the commotion. The crowd parted as Mr. Taylor, the assistant principal, approached. His tall frame and no-nonsense demeanor made the kids scatter back to their seats. He turned to Tyler, his stern gaze locking onto the boy. "Hand it over," Mr. Taylor said, his voice firm. Tyler hesitated, then reluctantly handed the notebook back to Emma. She clutched it to her chest, her body trembling. "Detention, Tyler," Mr. Taylor said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And you'll apologize to Emma before the day is over." Tyler muttered something under his breath but didn't argue. He slunk away, leaving Emma alone at the table. Mr. Taylor crouched down so he was at eye level with Emma. His expression softened, the harsh lines of his face relaxing. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Emma nodded, though her throat felt tight. She wanted to thank him, but the words stayed stuck. "You don't have to let them treat you like that," Mr. Taylor said. "If anyone bothers you, come to me. Okay?" Emma nodded again, her grip on the notebook loosening slightly. Mr. Taylor gave her a small smile before standing and walking away, leaving her to finish her lunch in peace. The rest of the day passed in a blur, and before Emma knew it, she was sitting in the detention room. The small, windowless space felt suffocating, but she tried to focus on her notebook, letting the familiar patterns soothe her nerves. Mrs. Duncan walked in, carrying a stack of papers. She placed them on the desk in front of Emma, her expression stern. "I want you to write a letter explaining why you were late to class today," she said. "And I want you to think about how your actions affect others." Emma stared at the paper, her pencil hovering above it. She didn't know what to write. How could she explain something that felt so unexplainable? Mrs. Duncan sighed, sitting down across from her. "Emma, you're a bright girl. But you need to try harder. The world isn't going to wait for you to catch up." Emma's chest tightened at the words. She wanted to scream, to make Mrs. Duncan understand that it wasn't about trying harder. But instead, she stayed silent, her pencil scratching out a few halting words on the paper. After detention, as Emma packed up her things to leave, Mrs. Duncan noticed the notebook sticking out of her backpack. Something about it caught her attention. Maybe it was the intricate designs or the way Emma guarded it so fiercely. "May I see that?" Mrs. Duncan asked, her voice softer than usual. Emma hesitated, but eventually handed over the notebook. Mrs. Duncan flipped through the pages, her eyes widening as she took in the elaborate patterns and symbols. They weren't just doodles, they were meticulous, almost mathematical in their precision. Some of the designs looked like blueprints, while others resembled star maps. "What is this?" Mrs. Duncan asked, her tone filled with genuine curiosity. Emma shifted uncomfortably. I like patterns," she said quietly. "They help me think." Mrs. Duncan studied the notebook for a moment longer before handing it back. For the first time, she saw Emma not as a problem to be solved, but as a mystery to be understood. That evening, Mrs. Duncan couldn't stop thinking about the notebook. She did some research, poring over articles and forums about autism and giftedness. The more she read, the more she realized how little she truly understood about Emma's world. The next day, Mrs. Duncan approached Mr. Taylor in the staff lounge. "There's something about Emma," she began, her voice hesitant. "I think we might have been seeing her the wrong way." Mrs. Duncan couldn't sleep that night. She lay in bed replaying the events of the day over and over in her mind. The look on Emma's face as she clutched that notebook, the careful precision of the patterns she had drawn, it all told a story that Mrs. Duncan was only now beginning to understand. For the first time, she realized she had been wrong about Emma, and the weight of that realization pressed heavily on her chest. The next morning, as she sat at her desk preparing for the day, Mrs. Duncan resolved to do better. She wouldn't jump to conclusions about Emma anymore. She would take the time to understand her, to figure out what she needed to thrive. But first, she needed to learn more about what she had seen in that notebook. When the students began filing into the classroom, Mrs. Duncan's gaze immediately went to Emma, who quietly slipped into her usual seat in the back corner. Emma kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone as she pulled out her notebook and a pencil. Mrs. Duncan watched her for a moment, noting how she seemed to find comfort in the act of drawing. She decided not to interrupt her just yet. After lunch, Mrs. Duncan asked Emma to stay behind for a moment. Emma froze, her hands gripping her backpack tightly as the other students filed out of the room. Once they were alone, Mrs. Duncan approached her desk, careful to keep her tone gentle. "Emma," she began, "I want to apologize. I think I've misunderstood you, and I want to make things right." Emma blinked, her wide eyes searching Mrs. Duncan's face for any sign of insincerity. "You don't have to apologize," she said softly. "But I do," Mrs. Duncan insisted. "I've been too quick to judge, and I didn't take the time to understand what you need. That's on me, not you." Emma didn't say anything, but her posture relaxed slightly and she nodded. "I was looking at your drawings yesterday," Mrs. Duncan continued. "They're incredible. I've never seen anything like them. Can you tell me more about them?" Emma hesitated, her fingers twitching nervously. "They're just patterns," she said after a moment. "I like how they fit together. It makes sense in my head." Mrs. Duncan nodded. "It seems like you have a very unique way of seeing the world. I think that's a gift." Emma's cheeks turned pink at the compliment, and she looked down at her notebook. "It doesn't feel like a gift," she mumbled. "People think I'm weird." "You're not weird," Mrs. Duncan said firmly. "You're brilliant. And I want to help you show that to the world." That evening, Mrs. Duncan did more research. She stayed up late reading about autism, neurodivergence, and how some children experience the world in ways that others can't fully understand. The more she learned, the more she realized how much she had failed Emma. But she was determined to change that. The next day, Mrs. Duncan met with Mr. Taylor in his office. She brought Emma's notebook with her, carefully explaining what she had observed and what she had learned from her research. "I think Emma might be on the spectrum," Mrs. Duncan said, her voice steady. "And I think we've been handling things all wrong." Mr. Taylor leaned back in his chair, studying the notebook. "This is impressive," he admitted. "But are you sure about this? We can't diagnose her. That's not our place." "I know," Mrs. Duncan said. "But we can talk to her mother. We can suggest that she get evaluated. Emma deserves to have the support she needs." Mr. Taylor nodded slowly. "But let's set up a meeting with her mother. But be careful how you approach this. We don't want her to feel judged." A few days later, Emma's mother, Mrs. Hayes, arrived for the meeting. She was a kind-looking woman with tired eyes and a warm smile. She took a seat across from Mrs. Duncan and Mr. Taylor, her hands folded nervously in her lap. "Thank you for coming," Mrs. Duncan began. "We wanted to talk to you about Emma." Mrs. Hayes's smile faltered slightly. "Is she in trouble?" "No, not at all," Mrs. Duncan assured her. "Emma is a wonderful student. She's incredibly intelligent and creative. But we've noticed that she sometimes struggles with transitions and social interactions, and we think there might be something more going on." Mrs. Hayes's expression softened. "I've always known Emma was different," she admitted. "She's always been so sensitive to everything, sounds, lights, even certain fabrics. And she's always been so quiet, so in her own world. But I didn't know what to do about it." Mrs. Duncan nodded. "We think it might be worth having her evaluated. If she is on the spectrum, there are resources and support systems that could really help her." Mrs. Hayes's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled through them. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for caring about her." The weeks that followed marked a turning point for Emma. Her mother arranged for her to see a specialist, who confirmed that Emma was indeed on the autism spectrum. The diagnosis brought clarity, not just for Emma and her family, but for her teachers as well. Mrs. Duncan worked hard to create a more supportive environment for Emma in the classroom. She implemented small changes that made a big difference, like giving Emma advance notice of schedule changes and providing her with noise-canceling headphones to help her focus. She also encouraged Emma to share her drawings with the class, showcasing her unique talents. At first, Emma was hesitant. She didn't like being the center of attention, and she worried that her classmates would mock her like Tyler had. But with Mrs. Duncan's encouragement, she agreed to give it a try. The day Emma presented her drawings to the class was one she would never forget. She stood at the front of the room, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands, her heart pounding in her chest. The other students watched her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "These are my patterns," Emma began, her voice trembling. "I like how they fit together. It makes sense to me." She flipped through the pages, showing her classmates the intricate designs. At first, the room was silent. Then, one by one, the students began to murmur. "Wow," one girl said. "That's really cool." "It looks like a maze," another boy added. "How did you do that?" Emma's cheeks flushed with pride as the compliments poured in. For the first time, she felt seen, not as the weird girl in the back of the class, but as someone with a unique gift to share. Mrs. Duncan couldn't have been prouder. She watched as Emma slowly began to come out of her shell, gaining confidence with each passing day. The other students, inspired by Emma's bravery, started to include her in their activities, inviting her to join them at lunch and on the playground. Tyler, who had been the source of so much of Emma's pain, even apologized to her, though his awkward delivery made Emma giggle. One afternoon, as the school day was winding down, Mrs. Duncan called Emma to her desk. "I have something for you," she said, handing Emma a small wrapped package. Emma looked at her, confused but curious. "What is it?" "Open it," Mrs. Duncan said with a smile. Emma carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a sketchbook with a set of colored pencils. Her eyes widened with delight as she ran her fingers over the smooth cover. "I thought you might like a bigger canvas for your patterns," Mrs. Duncan said. "I can't wait to see what you create." Emma smiled, a rare, radiant smile that lit up her entire face. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." As the weeks turned into months, Emma continued to thrive. Her patterns became more complex, her confidence grew, and she found her voice in ways she never thought possible. Mrs. Duncan, too, learned an important lesson, that every child is unique and it's a teacher's job to meet them where they are, not where they're expected to be. By the end of the school year, Emma was no longer the quiet girl in the back of the class. She was the girl with the patterns, the girl who saw the world in a way no one else could. And for the first time, she felt proud of who she was. By the time summer rolled around, Emma's transformation was undeniable. She walked into class each morning with a sense of calm she hadn't felt before. The once overwhelming buzz of chatter and activity no longer sent her into a spiral of anxiety. She had her tools now, her patterns, her headphones, and most importantly, her voice. She wasn't invisible anymore. Mrs. Duncan marveled at the changes. Emma still had her quiet moments, preferring the solace of her sketchbook to the chaos of group projects, but her confidence in her abilities was clear. She had even started volunteering answers in class, her voice soft but sure. Her classmates, who once kept their distance, now sought her out for help, especially when it came to creative projects. Emma's patterns had become a source of fascination and admiration. One day, as the class worked on a math assignment, Mrs. Duncan noticed Emma's hand shoot up. She paused mid-sentence, taken aback for a moment, before smiling. "Yes, Emma?" Emma lowered her hand slowly, her gaze steady. "I think the equation on the board has a mistake," she said, her voice clear. Mrs. Duncan turned to the board, examining the problem she had written. Sure enough, there was a minor error in her calculations. She corrected it quickly, then turned back to Emma. "Good catch, Emma." "Thank you." The class murmured in surprise. It wasn't often that a student corrected a teacher, and even less often that the teacher took it so gracefully. Emma, for her part, simply nodded and returned to her work. But Mrs. Duncan could see the faint smile tugging at her lips. As the summer semester drew to a close, Mrs. Duncan decided to organize a small classroom exhibition. Each student was encouraged to showcase something they were proud of, an art piece, a story, a science experiment. It was a chance for the children to celebrate their individuality and creativity. When Mrs. Duncan approached Emma about participating, she hesitated. "What if they don't like it?" Emma asked, clutching her sketchbook tightly. "They will," Mrs. Duncan assured her. "But even if they don't, what matters is that you like it. This is your chance to share what makes you special." Emma nodded, though her nervousness lingered. Over the next few days, she worked tirelessly on her project, staying up late at night with her colored pencils and sketchbooks spread out on the kitchen table. Her mother watched her with quiet pride, marveling at how far her daughter had come. The day of the exhibition arrived, and the classroom buzzed with excitement. Parents, Teachers and students wandered between displays, admiring the variety of projects on show. Emma's table, tucked in a corner, was simple but striking. Her sketchbook lay open, the pages carefully arranged to display her most intricate patterns. Beside it was a large poster she had created, filled with colorful designs that seemed to dance across the paper. At first, Emma stayed in the background, watching nervously as people approached her table. But as more and more visitors stopped to admire her work, she began to relax. She even answered questions, explaining how she saw the world in patterns and why creating them brought her peace. One man, a tall figure in a tweed jacket, lingered at Emma's table longer than most. He studied her designs intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, he turned to her with a smile. "These are remarkable," he said. "Have you ever considered architecture or design?" Emma blinked, startled by the question. "I'm just a kid," she said softly. The man chuckled. "Maybe so, but you have a gift. You see things in a way most people don't. That's something special." Emma's cheeks flushed with pride, and for the first time, she thought about what her patterns might mean beyond the classroom. After the exhibition, Mrs. Duncan called Emma's mother aside. "She has an incredible talent," she said. "Have you thought about enrolling her in any programs or workshops? Something that would nurture her creativity?" Mrs. Hayes nodded. "I've been looking into a few things. There's an art center downtown that offers classes for kids." Emma's been hesitant, but I think she's starting to believe in herself. "She should," Mrs. Duncan said firmly. "She has so much to offer. And she's just getting started." As the summer days stretched on, Emma began attending weekly art classes at the center. At first, she was shy and reserved, sticking to her usual patterns and avoiding eye contact with the other kids. But over time, she began to open up. The instructors, impressed by her precision and creativity, encouraged her to experiment with new techniques. She started blending her patterns with landscapes, creating intricate designs that seemed to flow seamlessly into the natural world. One day, the instructor announced a citywide youth art competition. Emma's first instinct was to say no. She wasn't ready for something so big. But her mother and Mrs. Duncan encouraged her, reminding her of how far she'd come. "You don't have to win," her mother said. "Just show them what you can do." Reluctantly, Emma agreed. Over the next few weeks, she poured her heart into her submission. She created a sprawling piece that combined her love of patterns with her newfound interest in architecture, a cityscape filled with swirling designs and vibrant colors. It was unlike anything she had ever done before, and by the time she finished, she felt a quiet pride in her work. The day of the competition arrived, and Emma stood nervously in the art center's gallery, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The room was filled with people, judges, other young artists, and their families. Her piece was displayed on the wall alongside dozens of others, each one unique and beautiful. When the winners were announced, Emma didn't expect to hear her name. But when the judge called out first place, Emma Hayes, the room erupted in applause. Her mother hugged her tightly, tears streaming down her face, while Mrs. Duncan clapped enthusiastically from the back of the room. Emma stepped forward to accept her ribbon, her heart pounding with a mix of nerves and excitement. As she stood on the small stage, holding her award, she glanced out at the crowd. For the first time, she felt truly seen, not as the quiet, weird girl who sat in the back of the classroom, but as someone with a voice and a gift worth sharing. Back at school, word of Emma's win spread quickly. Her classmates, who had once dismissed her, now treated her with newfound respect. Even Tyler, the class troublemaker, approached her one day during recess. "Your drawing was cool," he said awkwardly, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Like, really cool?" Emma smiled. "Thanks," she said. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she needed to say anything more. As the new school year began, Mrs. Duncan reflected on everything that had happened over the past few months. She had learned as much from Emma as Emma had learned from her, and she was a better teacher because of it. She knew that every child was different, and that it was her job to find the key that unlocked their potential. Emma, too, had learned an important lesson, that being different wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was something to celebrate. And as she walked into class on the first day of school, her sketchbook tucked under her arm, she knew that this year would be even better than the last. For Emma, the journey was just beginning. But one thing was certain, she was no longer the girl sent to detention for being misunderstood. She was the girl who saw the world in patterns, who turned her struggles into strengths, and who inspired everyone around her to see the world a little differently. The fall semester at Briarwood Elementary began with a crispness in the air, and for Emma, it felt like the start of something new. The weight she had once carried, of feeling out, of place and misunderstood, seemed lighter now. Her confidence had grown over the summer, bolstered by her success at the art competition and the unwavering support of those around her. Mrs. Duncan started the first day of school by welcoming the class with a warm smile. "This year," she began, "we're going to focus on celebrating what makes each of you unique. Everyone in this room has a gift to share, and I can't wait to see what you all accomplish." Emma sat at her desk, her sketchbook resting in front of her. For the first time, she felt like she belonged, not just in the classroom, but in the world. She wasn't afraid to raise her hand anymore, and when Mrs. Duncan asked for volunteers to help decorate the bulletin board, Emma was the first to step forward. As the weeks went by, Emma's reputation as the pattern girl grew. Her classmates often gathered around her during art projects, marveling at her ability to create intricate designs that seemed to flow effortlessly from her pencil. Even Tyler, who had once teased her mercilessly, had become one of her biggest supporters. One day during recess, Tyler approached Emma with a sheepish grin. "Hey," he said, kicking at the dirt. "Can you help me with something?" Emma looked up from her sketchbook, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Tyler hesitated, then held out a crumpled piece of paper. "It's my mom's birthday next week, and I thought maybe I could draw her something. But I'm not good at art." Emma studied the paper, which was blank except for a few shaky pencil lines. She smiled softly. "I can help," she said. Over the next few days, Emma and Tyler worked together during lunch breaks, creating a beautiful card filled with swirling patterns and bright colors. When Tyler presented it to his mom, her reaction was everything he had hoped for. "This is amazing," she said, pulling him into a tight hug. "Thank you, sweetheart." Tyler couldn't stop smiling as he recounted the story to Emma the next day. "She loved it," he said. "I couldn't have done it without you." Emma shrugged, her cheeks turning pink. "You did most of it," she said modestly. But the pride in her eyes betrayed her. Meanwhile, Mrs. Duncan continued to look for ways to challenge Emma and nurture her talents. She introduced Emma to the concept of tessellations, geometric patterns that repeat without gaps or overlaps. And Emma took to it immediately. Her designs became even more complex, blending math and art in ways that left everyone around her in awe. One afternoon, Mrs. Duncan pulled Emma aside. "I've been thinking," she said, "there's a science fair coming up next month. It's not just about experiments. You can present anything that shows a connection between science, math, and creativity. I think you'd be perfect for it." Emma's eyes widened. "The science fair?" she asked, her voice tinged with both excitement and apprehension. "I've never done one before." "I'll help you," Mrs. Duncan promised. "And I think your patterns would be an amazing addition. You can show how math and art intersect." Emma hesitated, her mind racing. The idea of standing in front of a crowd and explaining her work was daunting. But she also knew it was an opportunity she couldn't pass up. "Okay," she said finally. "I'll do it." Over the next few weeks, Emma threw herself into the project. With Mrs. Duncan's guidance, she created a presentation that explored the mathematical principles behind her patterns. She used terms like symmetry, fractals, and repetition, weaving them into a narrative that was both educational and inspiring. Her display board featured examples of her work, from simple sketches to elaborate tessellations. She even included a small hands-on activity, inviting visitors to create their own patterns using pre-cut shapes. As the day of the science fair approached, Emma's nerves grew. She practiced her presentation in front of her mother and Mrs. Duncan, stumbling over her words at first but gaining confidence with each attempt. "You've got this," Mrs. Duncan said, giving her a reassuring smile. "Just remember to be yourself. People will love what you have to say." The gymnasium buzzed with activity on the day of the fair. Students, Parents and teachers wandered from booth to booth, admiring the creative displays. Emma's table was near the center of the room, her colorful patterns immediately drawing attention. At first, Emma stayed behind her table, letting people look at her work without engaging too much. But as more visitors stopped to ask questions, she found herself opening up. She explained how she saw patterns in everyday life, how the ripples in water or the petals of a flower inspired her designs. The more she talked, the more animated she became, her passion shining through. One of the judges, a tall woman with silver hair and kind eyes, spent a long time at Emma's table. She asked thoughtful questions about Emma's process and praised her ability to combine art and science. "You have a rare gift," the judge said. "I hope you continue to explore it. The world needs more people who can see beauty in both math and art." Emma beamed, her confidence soaring. For the first time, she felt like she had something truly special to offer. At the end of the day, the winners were announced. Emma didn't expect to win, she was just proud of herself for participating. But when her name was called for the Best Integration of Art and Science award, she felt a rush of joy unlike anything she had ever experienced. Mrs. Duncan and her mother clapped loudly as Emma stepped up to accept her ribbon. The applause filled the room, a chorus of validation that made all her hard work worth it. The science fair marked another turning point in Emma's journey. Her confidence continued to grow, and she began to dream of a future where her patterns could make a difference. She imagined becoming an architect, designing buildings that blended function and beauty, or a mathematician who used art to solve complex problems. But more than that, Emma began to see herself in a new light. She wasn't just the quiet girl in the back of the class or the weird kid who didn't fit in. She was Emma Hayes, a girl with a gift, a voice, and a world of possibilities ahead of her. Mrs. Duncan watched Emma's progress with pride. She knew that Emma's journey was far from over, but she also knew that the girl who had once been sent to detention for being misunderstood was now a shining example of what could happen when someone was given the support and encouragement they needed. Emma had taught Mrs. Duncan an invaluable lesson, that every child was unique, and it was a teacher's responsibility to meet them where they were. With the right guidance, even the most overlooked students could blossom into something extraordinary. The following spring, Mrs. Duncan received a letter from Emma's mother. It was written in neat, looping handwriting and smelled faintly of lavender. "Dear Mrs. Duncan, I just wanted to take a moment to thank you for everything you've done for Emma. I've seen her grow so much over the past year, and I know that's because of your kindness and understanding. You saw something in her that no one else did, and you helped her believe in herself. For that, I will always be grateful. Emma talks about you all the time. She says you're the best teacher she's ever had. And I agree. Thank you for changing her life. With gratitude, Sir Hayes." Mrs. Duncan wiped a tear from her eye as she folded the letter. Teaching was never easy, but moments like this reminded her why she had chosen this path. She had made a difference, not just in Emma's life, but in the lives of everyone Emma would go on to inspire. And for that, she was eternally grateful. Spring blossomed into summer, and with it came new challenges and opportunities for Emma. She had grown so much in the past year, but she still had moments when the world felt overwhelming. Her success at the science fair had given her a newfound sense of pride, but the quiet fears that had followed her for so long hadn't disappeared entirely. Yet, every time doubt crept in, she reminded herself of everything she had achieved, and the people who believed in her. Mrs. Duncan, as always, remained a steady source of support. Though Emma was no longer in her class, they stayed in touch. Mrs. Duncan invited her to stop by after school whenever she wanted to talk or share her latest patterns. Emma often took her up on the offer, bringing her sketchbook and chatting about her day while Mrs. Duncan graded papers. Their bond was a testament to the power of understanding and encouragement. One afternoon, as Emma sat at Mrs. Duncan's desk, carefully shading a new design, Mrs. Duncan leaned forward. "Emma," she began, her tone thoughtful, "have you ever thought about sharing your work with more people? Beyond just school?" Emma looked up, her pencil hovering above the page. "What do you mean?" "I mean entering it into contests, maybe displaying it at a gallery," Mrs. Duncan said. "Your patterns are so unique, and I think a lot of people would love to see them." Emma hesitated. The idea of sharing her work with strangers made her stomach flutter with nerves. "I don't know," she said softly. "What if they don't like it?" Mrs. Duncan smiled. "Art isn't about pleasing everyone. It's about expressing yourself. And I think your work could inspire people in ways you can't even imagine." Emma thought about it for a moment. She had always drawn for herself, finding solace and clarity in the patterns she created. But the idea of sharing her gift with the world, of maybe making a difference, was exciting in a way she couldn't ignore. "Maybe," she said finally, a small smile tugging at her lips. Over the summer, Emma began exploring ways to share her art. Her mother helped her set up an account on an online platform where young artists could showcase their work. At first, Emma was hesitant to post anything, but with a little encouragement from Mrs. Duncan and her mom, she uploaded a few of her favorite designs. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People from all over the world commented on her posts, praising her creativity and asking about her process. Some even asked if she sold her work or took commissions. Emma was stunned. She had never imagined her patterns would resonate with so many people. Her confidence grew with each new message of support. She started experimenting with new styles and techniques, blending her love of patterns with themes inspired by nature, architecture, and even her favorite books. Her art became a way to connect with others, to share the way she saw the world. One day, as Emma scrolled through the comments on her latest post, a message caught her eye. It was from a gallery owner in the city who had stumbled upon her work and was interested in featuring it in an upcoming youth art exhibit. Emma's hands trembled as she read the message. A gallery? The thought was almost too big to process. She showed the message to her mom, who immediately hugged her. "Emma, this is incredible," her mom exclaimed. "You have to say yes?" "But what if I'm not good enough?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mom knelt down, looking her in the eye. "You are good enough," she said firmly. "You've worked so hard for this and you deserve it. Don't let fear hold you back." Emma nodded slowly, her mom's words sinking in. She replied to the message that evening, agreeing to participate in the exhibit. The gallery owner responded quickly, outlining the details and expressing excitement about showcasing her work. The weeks leading up to the exhibit were a whirlwind. Emma spent every spare moment creating new pieces, pouring her heart into each one. She wanted her collection to tell a story, not just about patterns, but about how she saw the world and her journey to embrace who she was. Mrs. Duncan visited her one afternoon to see her progress. As she looked at the pieces spread across the table, her eyes filled with pride. "Emma," she said, her voice soft, "these are breathtaking. You've captured something truly special." Emma beamed, her cheeks turning pink. "Thank you," she said. I want people to understand that being different isn't a bad thing." "They will," Mrs. Duncan assured her. "Your art speaks louder than words ever could." The day of the exhibit arrived, and Emma stood in the gallery, her heart pounding as she surveyed the room. Her pieces were displayed on a central wall, each one carefully framed and accompanied by a small plaque with her name and a brief description. The gallery buzzed with activity as visitors moved from one display to the next, admiring the work of the young artists. Emma stayed close to her mom, nervously watching as people stopped to look at her pieces. She heard snippets of conversation, words like unique, stunning, and innovative, and her nerves began to melt away. For the first time, she felt truly seen. Halfway through the evening, the gallery owner approached Emma with a warm smile. "Emma, I'd like to introduce you to someone," she said, gesturing to a man standing nearby. "This is Mr. Fields. He's an art professor at the local university, and he's very impressed with your work." Emma's eyes widened as she shook Mr. Fields' hand. "It's an honor to meet you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The honor is mine," Mr. Fields replied. "Your patterns are remarkable. Have you ever considered pursuing art professionally?" Emma hesitated. The idea of being an artist had always felt like a distant dream, something too big and too far out of reach. I don't know," she admitted. "Well, if you ever decide to," Mr. Fields said, "I'd be happy to help. We have a summer program for young artists, and I think you'd be a perfect fit." Emma's heart leapt. "Really?" she asked. "Absolutely. he said with a nod. "You have a rare talent, Emma. I'd love to see where it takes you." As the exhibit came to a close, Emma felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had faced her fears, shared her work with the world, and discovered new possibilities she had never imagined. Her journey wasn't over, it was just beginning. That evening, as she sat in her room sketching, Emma thought about how far she had come. She thought about Mrs. Duncan, who had seen her potential when no one else had. She thought about her mom, who had always believed in her even when she doubted herself. And she thought about the future, which no longer felt so scary. Emma smiled as her pencil danced across the page, creating a new pattern filled with swirling shapes and vibrant colors. It was a reflection of everything she had learned and everything she hoped to become. For the first time, she felt like she could take on the world, and she couldn't wait to see where her patterns would lead her next. The weeks following the gallery exhibit passed in a blur for Emma. Her name began to circulate beyond the small circle of her school and the art community. The response to her work at the gallery was overwhelming. People from all walks of life seemed drawn to her patterns, leaving heartfelt comments on the gallery's website and emailing her mother to inquire about purchasing her art. It was as if Emma's unique way of seeing the world had unlocked something in others, inspiring them to appreciate the beauty in complexity. For Emma, it was both exhilarating and overwhelming. She was still adjusting to her newfound confidence and the attention that came with it. Some days, she wanted to retreat into her sketchbook, where the world felt safe and manageable. But then she remembered the words of her teacher, Mrs. Duncan, "Your art speaks louder than words ever could." Emma wanted to keep sharing her voice, even when it scared her. One day, during art class at school, Mrs. Duncan stopped by to see how Emma was doing. The students were working on a collaborative mural, painting a vibrant scene of their town. Emma had been tasked with creating the border, filling it with her signature intricate patterns. She worked quietly, her brush moving with steady precision, while her classmates filled the center with colorful depictions of houses, trees, and people. "That's beautiful, Emma," Mrs. Duncan said, leaning down to admire her work. "You're adding so much depth to the mural." Emma smiled shyly. "Thanks," she said. "I like how everyone's parts fit together." "That's the beauty of collaboration," Mrs. Duncan said. "Everyone brings something unique to the table." As Mrs. Duncan stood, she noticed a boy standing nearby, watching Emma intently. It was Tyler. He had been assigned to paint a section of the mural, but his brush hung limply in his hand as he stared at Emma's patterns. "Do you think you could show me how to do that?" Tyler asked hesitantly. Emma glanced up, surprised. She wasn't used to people asking her for help, but she nodded, setting her brush down. "Sure," she said. "It's not that hard once you get the hang of it." She handed Tyler a smaller brush and showed him how to create the swirling shapes that formed the foundation of her designs. Tyler followed her instructions carefully, his initial awkwardness giving way to focus. "Like this?" he asked, holding up the brush. Emma nodded. "Yeah, that's good. Just keep adding layers." As Tyler worked, the other students began to take notice. A few of them wandered over, curious about what Emma was teaching him. Before long, a small group had gathered around her, asking questions and trying their hand at her patterns. Emma found herself explaining her process, her confidence growing with each word. Mrs. Duncan watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride. This was the Emma she had always believed in, someone who could inspire others with her talent and her quiet strength. At home, Emma's mother sat her down one evening with exciting news. "Emma," she began, "I got a call today from someone at the art center. They've been following your work, and they want to feature you in a special showcase for young artists." Emma's eyes widened. "A showcase?" she asked. Her mom nodded. "It's a big event, with artists from all over the state. They think you'd be a great addition." Emma felt a mixture of excitement and fear. The gallery exhibit had been a big step, but this felt even bigger. "What would I have to do?" she asked. "They want you to create a new collection," her mom explained. "Something that represents who you are as an artist." Emma's heart raced at the thought. A whole collection? It was a daunting task, but also an incredible opportunity. She glanced at her sketchbook, already filled with ideas. Maybe she was ready for this challenge. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady. Over the next few months, Emma poured herself into her work. She spent hours each day sketching, refining, and experimenting with new ideas. She wanted her collection to tell a story, not just about her patterns, but about her journey. She drew inspiration from the people and places around her, the laughter of her classmates, the quiet strength of her mother, the encouragement of Mrs. Duncan. Each piece was a reflection of the world as she saw it, vibrant and full of interconnected beauty. Her favorite piece was one she titled Threads of Light. It was a sprawling design that combined her signature patterns with bursts of color that seemed to radiate outward like beams of sunlight. It was her way of expressing hope and connection, the things she had come to value most. As the showcase approached, Emma felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety. She wanted to make everyone who believed in her proud, but she also worried about how her work would be received. What if people didn't understand her patterns? What if they thought they were strange? Mrs. Duncan, sensing Emma's nerves, pulled her aside one afternoon. "Emma," she said gently, "remember what I told you. Art isn't about pleasing everyone. It's about expressing yourself. Your work is a gift, and anyone who sees it will feel that." Emma nodded, holding on to her teacher's words like a lifeline. The day of the showcase arrived, and Emma stood in the bustling art center, surrounded by her collection. Her pieces were arranged on a large display wall, each one carefully framed and labeled. The room buzzed with activity as visitors moved from one exhibit to the next, their voices a low hum of excitement. Emma's mom stood by her side, beaming with pride. "You did it," she said, squeezing Emma's shoulder. "Look at how far you've come." Emma smiled, though her nerves were still bubbling beneath the surface. She watched as people stopped to admire her work, their expressions thoughtful and intrigued. A few even approached her to ask questions, and though her answers were shy at first, she found herself growing more comfortable with each interaction. One visitor in particular caught her attention. He was a man in his late 20s, dressed in a sharp suit, with an air of quiet confidence. He studied Emma's pieces intently, his gaze lingering on threads of light. When he turned to her, his expression was one of genuine admiration. "You have an incredible talent," he said. "The way you combine precision with emotion, it's rare." Emma blushed, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," she said softly. The man extended his hand. "My name is Daniel. I work for a design firm in the city. We specialize in architectural projects, and we're always looking for fresh perspectives. Have you ever considered applying your patterns to something like that?" Emma tilted her head, intrigued. "You mean, like buildings?" "Exactly," Daniel said. "Your work could be translated into stunning architectural designs, walls, windows, even entire facades. It's the kind of innovation we're always looking for." Emma's mind raced at the possibilities. She had never thought about her patterns in that way, but the idea excited her. "I don't know much about architecture," she admitted. "That's okay," Daniel said. "If you're interested, we'd love to mentor you. We have a summer program for young artists and designers. I think you'd be a perfect fit." Emma glanced at her mom, who nodded encouragingly. "You should think about it," her mom said. "It sounds like an amazing opportunity." Emma turned back to Daniel. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice steady. That evening, as Emma packed up her exhibit, she couldn't stop thinking about the offer. The idea of working on architectural designs felt both exciting and terrifying. But it also felt right. Her patterns had always been about finding connections, about seeing the world in a different way. Maybe this was the next step in her journey. As they drove home, Emma turned to her mom. "Do you think I could do it?" she asked. Her mom smiled. "I think you can do anything you set your mind to," she said. "And I'll be with you every step of the way." Emma nodded, her resolve strengthening. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she was ready to embrace it. Her patterns had opened doors she never knew existed, and she couldn't wait to see where they would lead. Back at home, Emma sat at her desk, sketching late into the night. Her pencil moved with purpose, creating shapes and lines that flowed seamlessly across the page. This was her voice, her way of telling the world who she was. And she was just getting started.